Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And yes, I am finally back from America, so I'm getting back into the swing of actually recording things after being away for a bit. But today I wanted to talk about the recent discussions and arguments and controversies over like Roald Dahl and Ian Fleming's books and R.L. Stein's Goosebumps and this whole idea of censorship, particularly of children's fiction. The Ian Fleming things are a bit of an outlier, and maybe I'll get time to mention that. But I wanted to go through some of the key arguments and how some of the reporting on this, and certainly a lot of the social media discussion, has either intentionally or accidentally reframed things in a different direction. How a number of people are, and I mean this in the non pejorative sense, are ignorant of the history of what they are talking about. They don't know about the history of what they are talking about, and because of that, have leapt to certain assumptions. Now, from the very beginning, I want it to be clear I am not a fan of going back and changing original works. Even if it is done with the permission of the author or the copyright holder or whoever, I prefer that's the original work. And I'll get to that point in a minute, but I want to known from the beginning. That is my stance on this. At the same time, I am not clutching my pearls over these decisions. And I'm going to go through a number of the key arguments here. And the first is there's a lot of discussion about this being a new trend, a new woke trend, or this is this new thing about sensitivity readers. One of the terms for what was done to the Roald Dahl books by the Roald Dahl Book Company in conjunction with the publisher. That's a very important point that people sometimes overlook. But another term for that is boulderization. Boulderization was coined after, I think it was a guy, Thomas Boulder, in the early 19th century, who took the Bible and the works of Shakespeare and expurged some of the smuttier aspects of Shakespeare, got rid of some of the rude jokes, made them cleaner for polite company. He cleaned up the text because they were to be read aloud in a polite social circle, and it would be embarrassing to have these rude bits in it. So that's why it's called boulderization. And that's early 19th century, 1820s or something like that. So this is not new. And the other term I used there was expurgation. This is when you go through and you remove objectionable material from a text. That goes back to at least the 13th century, I think, one of the popes. But this is not a new thing. This is not a new woke movement. This has been part of literature for centuries. So anyone who is getting upset that this is this new thing is overlooking that this has always been done. And in fact, we're all aware of times when it has been done, usually very badly, but we can understand. For instance, if you have an R-rated movie and it is being broadcast on TV before the watershed, they used to dub out the swear words. So you quite often had an action hero saying, "Fudge you." And you're like, I don't think the original said fudge, now do you? That is an example of this. That because it was being shown at a time for an audience for which the swear word was going to be inappropriate, they changed the swear word. Now, it was a wee bit silly, but we put up with it. And we weren't in a moral panic about it. We weren't, oh, this is ruining the. We just sort of went, oh, God. And we moved on because that's the level of change quite often. It's removing offensive words. Now, let's move on to the next point. A lot of people saying, you shouldn't change the originals. How dare you do this? We want the originals back. There's a bit of a problem with that, specifically about the Roald Dahl books. We haven't been reading the originals. The originals got changed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, Roald Dahl. Best example of this is the Oompa Loompas. And in fact, I think in one of the biographies of Roald Dahl, there was something along the lines of There was actually a discussion about this, and I apologize for the language here, but Roald Dahl was forced by his publishers to, in his own words, de-negro the Oompa Loompas. The Oompa Loompas were originally pygmies from deepest, darkest Africa that Willy Wonka saves as a white savior and brings his slave labor to his factory where he feeds them cocoa beans. People at the time were in the UK, because it was this whole sort of commentary on Victorian blah blah blah, kind of went with it. And there was an element of racism in society at the time it was published that still present, but there wasn't a big brouhaha about this. But when they were being published in the States, this was causing consternation. And a statement along the line, something about in a racially mixed society, the Oompa Loompas are not acceptable, as originally written. Or there was a statement along those lines. And in the before the publication of Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, they reissued Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and changed the Oompa Loompas into hippies with golden brown hair and rosy white skin. And if you think of all of the different adaptations, because the adaptation then with Gene Wilder, that film adaptation, they were changed again to make them more fantasy creatures. And all of this was to avoid that racism, that inherent racism from the original. So when people talk about, oh, we just want the originals, most people have not read the original version of the text from 1964. They've read altered texts that have already been boulderized from the 70s. So again, getting upset that this is happening, this has already been done. And admittedly, at that point in time, it was done with Roald Dahl's consent, albeit incredibly grudging consent that he was forced into by his editors. This was not a willing thing that Roald Dahl did at the time. He didn't go, you know what, I've changed my mind about this. He was forced to do it by his publishers. Now, because the publishers were saying, listen, you need to change this. These are the proposed changes. You have to authorize this. That's applying force in the situation and saying this must be done or the publication is in jeopardy. That's censorship. But that is not what people are complaining about. People are complaining about, why are sensitivity readers changing things now? And again, that is not quite what happened or is happening in a lot of these instances. At the beginning of 20 or sometime in 2018 through to 2020, the Roald Dahl Book Company was engaged in negotiating a deal with Netflix. And it was to do with purchasing the rights and licensing and all of this sort of stuff about developing the books and owning the books as immediate property. There's a whole big commercial corporate thing going on. As part of that, the Roald Dahl Book Company, in agreement with Puff and the publishers, engaged a group of sensitivity readers. Now, even the term sensitivity readers is being used to distinguish this from a group of any other subject specialists. We frequently refer to alpha readers, subject specialists, technical specialists who are brought in to help change the language of a book, often by an author at their own expense, particularly if they're self-published. But also, this is what alpha readers and beta readers sometimes bring subject specialism to it, or you get someone in who has a lived experience that can help inform the work. This is now a very common practice in the publishing industry for all sorts of things, from fight sequences, from depictions of mental illness, from depictions of the military and veterans. That people bring in subject specialists all the time, but for some reason, sensitivity readers are singled out as something different, even though this is now very commonplace across the whole of the publishing industry for all of these different things. But public morality, or whether it depicts people with disabilities and mental illness, or aspects of racism, colonialism, all of these things. Suddenly, this has been part of a politicized culture war rather than, as it is with so many of these other things, simply part of the subject matter of a novel that specialists are brought in. But in this instance, the Roald Dahl Book Company, in conjunction with Puffin, asked a group of specialists to go through the text so that, in conjunction with this new deal, they could reissue updated versions of the books to sell to a new generation of children for whom the text, as it currently stood, or as it stood at the time, might have been too old fashioned or not as engaging, or actually contained information or cultural attitudes that didn't reflect the power of the story and the most impressive elements of the story and the things that they wanted to continue. So this was a decision made by the copyright holder in conjunction and agreement with the publishing company, and there was no obligation on their part to take and make every single change. This was not sensitivity readers going in and changing the text. They suggested changes. The Roald Dahl Book Company and the publisher were free at any point to disregard them. They chose not to, because by making the changes, they would make the books more palatable to a new audience of children and their younger parents, who are part of a different generation as well from the originals that were, again, published in the 1960s, 1970s. Times and the culture have changed, and this was a way of updating the books for a new generation. Therefore, they would sell more books, they would make the books more appealing to Netflix to purchase, all of these sorts of things. That is not motivation by morality. That's motivation by capitalism. And this is the very logical extension and very foreseeable result of the extension of copyright that Disney has been pushing for so many years. Now we have copyright holders who are holding onto these texts long after an author has become deceased. And in order to keep them relevant, in order to, because they have a duty as copyright holders to continue to promote the books, this is the ultimate result of this. Very foreseeable that you keep extending these things, and as society changes over time, texts that reflect certain societal values or reflect the lack of attention and awareness that a society had towards certain problems continues long past what used to be maybe its sell-by date. This is a result of capitalism. This is not the moral panic that people are framing it as. And this brings me on to the point that some people keep making comparisons to 1984. Of the famous dystopias that people have heard of, you've picked the wrong one. 1984 was about government censorship and changing the newspapers to change the past. That's not what's happening here. Potentially a more apt, famous dystopia you could have picked for your comparison would be Brave New World, about the dangers of consumer capitalism run wild, where everything is a commodity, because that's actually more accurate to what's going on. Because, as I pointed out, in the whole Roald Dahl thing, this was not a government stepping in saying, you are not allowed to publish unless you change. That would be outright censorship. What we have is a paternalistic and interventionist form of editing, which, as we've established, has existed since about the 14th century. And that was applied. That the reason it was applied and the copyright holder didn't worry about it was we, through consumer capitalism, have changed art and cultural objects into commodities to continue to be sold, and therefore by iterating on the product that we have or the commodity that we have, we can resell it. Think of the new form of whatever phone that is basically exactly the same as the old phone, only a couple of millimeters bigger or has two extra cameras on it. That it's fundamentally the same phone. They just keep tweaking minor aspects of it, and yeah, it improves in performance and has a might run faster or the screen might be brighter, but these are all minor changes, not a big leap to a new thing. That's what we're seeing here with these books being turned into commodities. And Brave New World is a better exploration and warning about the dangers of that than 1984 is, because this is not about the overreach of a government censoring books. As Fahrenheit 451 is again the wrong, and at least to my mind, the wrong dystopia to reach for, because this was never about these books will not be allowed to be published because, as Puffin has decided to do, they're going to publish the originals, although they're not the originals, but they're going to publish earlier versions of the books alongside the revised versions. So there was never any fear that someone was stopping them from publishing. These books weren't being banned, they weren't being burned. So Fahrenheit 451 is the wrong one to go for as well. What we want is Brave New World. So people talking about it like it's 1984, that and censorship in that sense, and book burning and making all of those comparisons are going down the wrong line. But there is a point. These are cultural objects that illustrate societal values. And as I said at the beginning, I don't like seeing them changed. These are windows into how an author, how a society viewed certain subjects, what was considered normal, what was considered acceptable, or was at least accepted by the majority of that culture. The conscious and unconscious biases of the culture and society and the conversations that went on around it. These are really valuable sources for us looking into the past. Sometimes when we look at society, we forget how far we have come, how much has changed, because usually society changes in small incremental instances. But then we can have a period of quite radical change where some big things get changed. And we notice, we go, oh, things have suddenly changed. But by looking at books from our past, we actually see that it's not just the big changes that made the news or that were visible at the time. It's the little changes that add up over time. And we can suddenly realize how far we have come as a society by looking back. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we go, we've come this far, job's done. There are always things that we can improve. Society needs to continue to evolve. That is, part of progress and moving toward the future. But sometimes we forget how far we've come. And by looking back at popular literature from our past, we can actually see that change happen, or at least see the change in contrast to where we are now. And that is very, very useful. So by making these changes to the books, by altering these cultural objects, that is something I disagree with, because we lose something of that. And as long as they're kept around, as long as you can still access them, to have newly revised versions for a new audience, that isn't upsetting me, as long as, and when I say the originals, I mean the originals. I mean, anytime there was an editorial change to change something, that a copy of that is kept so that we can keep going back and we can actually map, even in something like Roald Dahl's books, the slow changes toward inclusivity, to be less racist, to be less sexist, to be less anti-Semitic, that we can actually map those changes as we see the minor editorial changes that have been made over time. And this is something that brings me on to, yes, children's literature tends to have a more interventionist and paternalistic attitude in its editing. And part of that, and I've seen this argument saying, no, we should have kept the originals because this was a learning moment. This was a teachable moment where parents or carers, in reading the books to these children, could have had those important conversations, or that teachers could have those important conversations. And while I understand that point, and I think it's great, not every child has that opportunity. And certainly a lot of teachers are being told that they shouldn't do that in the classroom and they should avoid those conversations because of where their school may be located in whatever country or whatever legal jurisdiction. There are big issues there about asking teachers to do this. But the point about parents and carers, that's absolutely valid and great for all of those children lucky enough to have people like that in their lives. And that's the thing, not every kid does. And so this is one of the reasons why editing for children's books can be more interventionist and paternalistic. This fear of corrupting children. No, I think children are far more robust than we ever give them credit for. But at the same time, children can be, let's just say let's say they have a lack of discernment when it comes to repeating things. As anyone traveling in a car with small children in the back will know, if you accidentally swear when being cut off by someone in traffic, you're going to hear that swear word repeated from the back seat ad nauseum for the entire journey. And that's because kids like to push taboos, not necessarily understanding what the full extent of the taboo is or what extent of the social norm or convention is. That's part of the problem. That's why people, editors, publishers, have that slightly paternalistic stance because they are more wary about it when it comes to children's literature. And I think we can all understand that we might necessarily agree with it. We might say, but in my family, you go, and that's great. That is important to be aware of. But we also must be aware of the fact that not everyone has the same opportunities, the same background, or the same resources that we have. And this is not to say that children can't learn on their own. They can. As I said, I'm in favor of keeping the original texts, but we can understand why they get changed. I'm trying to explain the change and the reason for it, not saying that, yes, this is the thing that we should do. And this comes to, I think, one of the most important points, which is by constantly re-editing and re-releasing these books, this is crowding out the marketplace for the new books and new authors that could have been the voice for a new generation. And I think that is an important point. These books that have been around, not just Roald Dahl, but standbys in the publishing industry, things that they can always count on to sell, they frequently take up shelf space in a bookstore. And shelf space in a bookstore is selling space. Because of that, it is harder to find the new books that will be the new Roald Dahl or the new Tolkien for the next generation. It's not to say that they won't eventually be found, but it makes it harder. And that is a shame because they would in turn become a window into the cultural values of the time. And by constantly re-editing and reissuing older works to try and keep up with how society changes, we're losing out on the new stories that reflect the society in which they were written. And yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for that because, again, part of why I love literature is it does give us window into these other cultures, be it our own past or into other places where books and stories are produced. So that's a sort of rundown of, I think, the majority of the arguments that have surrounded all of this. And again, it's not to say that I think this is great that they are doing it, but framing it as a moral panic, framing it as, oh, these woke sensitivity readers, that is ignoring the literary history of all of this stuff. It's ignoring the fact that a lot of the changes are not actually that significant. Most of them are very minor. And people are getting bent out of shape because they are weaponizing this discussion for a very different purpose. And that's why I think a lot of the comparisons to 1984 have been brought in, and a lot of these comparisons to this fear of, oh, well, this is a slippery slope, and suddenly we're just going to change all of these things, like Agatha Christie's, and then there were none. Oh, wait, they did make that change, and everyone was fine with it. Oh, well, I'm okay with changing like the outright racist stuff, but that's not that racist. Or I'm okay with them changing the racist stuff, but I don't see why they had to change the fat stuff. And once we see it in those terms, you go, right, so you're okay with them changing things that you can see are offensive. But just because you don't find something offensive doesn't mean that someone else does. That's why you bring in subject specialists, because they have an awareness greater than just the things that annoy them. And again, the power in all of this rested with the Roald Dahl Book Company and the publishers. They did not have to accept these changes. They were free not to do them. The reason they went ahead with this is that they thought that this would make more money. This would sell more books. So this was not about, oh, we're going to get cancelled. This was about, we can sell more books. That is a very important point that people often overlook. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.